Well, it's so nice to be here. So how many of you have spent any time in the Presidio? Awesome. All right. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining the landscape of the Presidio, but I do think just as I want to set a little bit of context for the conversation that we're going to have tonight about bridging the nature-culture divide in the Presidio. And I think it's safe to say there's really no better landscape that I know of in the National Park Service and maybe in America where the issues of nature and culture collide in quite the same way that they do in the Presidio. So it's a really fascinating place to be wrestling with what it means to be a landscape architect in the 21st century, working in the Anthropocene and wrestling with the challenges, the sort of shared challenges that we all wrestle with today. So, you know, a really pivotal moment for me in my career was, wow, boy, it's not a very good photo, but I'm sorry. Really pivotal moment for me happened very early in my career. I actually began my career in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area working for the National Park Service. And it was my first week in the office. And I visited Muir Woods. They took me on a field trip, and it was the Chief of Natural Resources and the Chief of Cultural Resources. And we were standing on this bridge in Muir Woods, and we were having a conversation about the extinction of the coho salmon. For those of you who know the coho salmon, it's a native fish. There aren't a lot of them. There are very, very few of them left now. And at that time, the population was declining. And they had just completed a study that had determined that the reason the salmon were going extinct was that in the 1930s, the WPA had realigned all of the banks of Redwood Creek. So this landscape is actually a cultural artifact. It's actually not a natural stream. So even though it looks like a natural stream, all of the edges, all of these edges of the stream had actually been rebuilt by the WPA. I had no idea. But the interesting thing for me was, here I was sitting on this bridge having a conversation with the two individuals that set policy for the National Park Service and the management of cultural and natural resources, and they were arguing. And they were arguing about what to do about the coho salmon. And the cultural resources experts said, these stone walls are a vitally important part of our cultural heritage. And the Chief of Natural Resources was arguing that they should be completely torn down and that the stream should be kind of returned to its original kind of moving, dynamic, natural condition. And there was no room for any compromise. And they fought and fought and fought on that bridge. And I just stood there. I was just out of graduate school, just after I'd known you, and listened to this conversation, and I couldn't believe it. And it ended in a complete stalemate. There was no compromise. There was no creativity. There were no ideas coming forth about an intermediate place, keeping some of it, adding new structures, thinking outside of the box of this as a design problem that needed to be solved through some creative intervention in the landscape. And that stalemate has continued for 30 years. In fact, just this year, the Park Service has finally come up with a plan to address the edges of Redwood Creek. And in that period of time, the population of coho salmon has continued to decline and decline and decline to the point where it's almost gone extinct in Redwood Creek. So for me, this was an important moment in my development where I began to understand how in the profession of landscape architecture, back then, this was in the very late 80s, early 90s, we were so trapped in this 19th century way of thinking about nature and culture. That nature and culture sit in opposition to each other, and that these are very ideological positions. And I was so frustrated by that experience, I actually left the National Park Service because their policies at that point were so based on a 19th century mindset about what nature was and what culture was that I couldn't tolerate working in an organization like that. So I left the National Park Service, and I actually went to work for the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, which is our nonprofit partner. And at that moment, the closure of the Presidio and the transfer of the Presidio from the Army to the National Park Service was announced. And the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, our nonprofit partner, played a huge role in conceptualizing a new model for how the Presidio could be preserved as a national park, which is a part of the story I'll come back to a little later. But they were very involved, and so I got my first introduction to the Presidio actually working on a plan for how to transition the site from the United States Army to the National Park Service. And it was a very interesting, a very exciting time, very interesting time in the world of public land management because it coincided with a moment in American history when parks were being defunded. And there was a move afoot to dramatically shrink. The federal budget was very high, the deficit was very high, and there was a move to shrink the budget. And to do that, there was a move to sell public land to actually pay down the national debt. And it was at that moment that the Presidio was transferring from the Army, which is a very well-funded organization in the federal government, to the National Park Service, which is a very poorly funded organization. And the conversation that unfolded actually has a critical role to play in the history of the Presidio. So I'll come back to the minute. But first I want to just introduce you a little bit to the Presidio, to its history and ecology, because again, that's a really critical piece of our story. So the Presidio is unique among national park sites in that it has a very long human history. Most national park sites I think of as the George Washington slept here type national park. There was one important moment, some pivotal moment in the history of the West, in geologic history, some important ecological phenomenon that happened in the place. Here we have a site that has 10,000 years of human history, and there are layers of that history inscribed in the landscape. We have Native American sites down at Crissy Field. We've dated back to the 12th century. We have other evidence that leads us to believe they were Native American presence much earlier than that. And because it's located at the Golden Gate, in 1776, the Anza Party worked their way up the coast, and they founded a presidio, or garrison, right at the entrance to the harbor, because they intuitively understood that a huge protected harbor like San Francisco Bay was going to be strategically important. Plus, they knew the Russians were coming. The Russians were working their way down the coast, and they wanted to create the northern end of the Spanish Empire, and so they built this garrison. This is one of the earliest representations we have of it, and it's actually one of the earliest European representations we have of the Golden Gate, which is what this is right over here, way before the bridge was ever built. One of the very earliest representations of the Presidio. Now that began, that settlement in 1776 began 220 years of military use of the site. And it's safe to say that the reason the Presidio wasn't developed like the rest of San Francisco is first the Golden Gate, and second the fact that culture after culture realized how strategically important the Golden Gate was, that it was absolutely essential to control the entrance to the harbor, and whoever controlled the entrance to the harbor essentially controlled California. And so first under the Spanish period, then under the Mexican period, and then under the Americans, when the land transferred in the middle of the 19th century, the Army base transferred from one government to the other. In fact, it was a transfer to the federal government of the United States before there was a California, and so it's never been local. It actually is one of the few places in America that has sole federal jurisdiction because it was never local. And it was the command. So many of the important moments in the history of the American West were directed from the Presidio. Some of them quite dark, some of them stories that really are sort of dark chapters like the Indian Wars. They were directed from the Presidio. But also things that we think of in a more positive light, like the recovery effort after the earthquake in 1906. These were all directed from the Presidio, and there are many points in its history where it actually provided the government for San Francisco and for California. Interestingly enough, from the very earliest days, it was an open Army base. And in the United States, it's very unusual for a military site to be open to the public. And the Presidio, because it sat in San Francisco, because it was so beautiful, very early on developed this history as an open Army base. And that's important for two reasons. The first is the public began to enjoy it starting in the 19th century. And they fell in love with it starting in the 19th century, and they continued to use it throughout the 20th century. It was closed for two very short periods of time, but other than that, it essentially functioned as a public park, even though it was military base. The second important reason, that's relevant to our story, is that it meant the Army really cared about the way it looked. And so unlike most Army base, they actually put a lot of attention into the landscapes. And so this is one of the many, many gardens and park-like environments that the Army built. They built pleasure grounds, they built Italianate gardens, they had these formal parade grounds. They especially loved obsolete military technology as a decorative element. These paths are all lined with old cannonballs when that technology became obsolete. And there are sort of waves of like cannon and rockets and all that stuff. Most people use sculpture, they use cannonballs. I mean, it was a military site. But what's relevant is they had a commitment to the quality of the environment that was really unique among American Army bases, and frankly continued all the way up until '89 when the base closure ended. In a similar vein, in the 1880s, they reimagined the entire landscape as a picturesque park. In the 1870s, the commanding officer of the Presidio was actually on the Parks Commission for the city of San Francisco, and he played a role in creating Golden Gate Park. And he brought all of those learnings back to the Presidio and was so inspired by the success of Golden Gate Park that he reimagined the entire Army base as a park, even though it was still an Army base. He recreated the roadway system and turned it into a series of pleasure routes where people could ride their carriages, and planted a 300-acre historic forest. And when you read the description of the historic forest, the actual plan is in the Bancroft Library, and there's a narrative description that goes along with it. It describes a very sophisticated design that was developed by an Army engineer, but inspired by the work of Olmsted and Cleveland and all of those great early park designers from the middle of the 19th century. Even though it was designed by a soldier and really promulgated by the commanding officer and really inspired by his love of the place and his excitement about what was going on in the world of the parks movement in America, he reimagined the entire Presidio as a landscape, and again, the sort of threw the gates open and encouraged the public to come and use the park. Again, even though it was a military base, a very unusual history in the history of the West. So because of all of these elements of the Presidio's history, what we've ended up with is this amazing collection of military architecture. Really, it's the best collection of military architecture in the West. Dates back to the 18th century, which in California is quite old. Portions of the Officers Club date back to the 1790s. There are about 470 historic buildings. There are about 1,200 historic features. The largest is the historic forest. The whole forest is actually a cultural resource. It's a historic feature. And because of that, in 1962, the whole post was designated National Historic Landmark District. And again, important detail because it meant the Army had to take care of the site in a way they were unaccustomed to. And it also meant that it became increasingly difficult for them to manage the site in the way that they had historically, where they had complete flexibility to tear anything down they wanted. And I actually believe it set in motion the movement that resulted in the land becoming a part of a park. Because it became so difficult for the Army to manage the land, it became no longer really cost effective for them to keep the site as a military base. But also because the public had loved it so much. In 1972, when the Golden Gate National Recreation Area was created, Phil Burton, who was a congressman at the time, drew a line around the Presidio and included a sentence in the legislation that said, if the land ever became surplus, it would automatically become a national park. So we end up with this very odd mosaic of things. It's a 2.5 square mile site. It has all the infrastructure of a small town. It has 800 buildings, totaling about 6 million square feet of built space. 470 of those buildings are historic. You can see all the dark green, that's the historic forest crowning the ridgetops and wandering through the site. It functioned as an independent entity in the middle of San Francisco. It had its own electrical grid. It has its own water treatment plant and water distribution system. It has its own police department. It has its own fire department. We're like Vatican City. You know, we're like this little island in the middle of San Francisco. So it's a very, very unique landscape, a very complicated landscape. And unfortunately, when the Army left, it was a very derelict landscape. They had underinvested for several decades in the Presidio. It had really fallen into a state of disrepair, both the historic buildings, but also even the landscape. The historic forest was reaching the end of its life, and it really started to deteriorate. And as a result, it was a very, very expensive base to rehabilitate. We did a study in the early 90s looking at what it would take to preserve the Presidio as a national park. And we determined that to simply restore the Presidio would, at that time, it cost about $700 million. And to put that in context, now that seems like very little money to me, frankly, because it's cost quite a bit more than that already to rehabilitate it. But back then, in the early 90s, the whole National Park Service, 410 national park sites, had a deferred maintenance backlog of $1.5 billion. So they were going to be taking on a $700 million additional deferred maintenance backlog, which is huge. Similarly, the maintenance costs, the ongoing operating costs of Presidio, were about $45 million a year. That was more than Yosemite and Yellowstone and Grand Canyon combined. So these huge national parks and this tiny Presidio in the middle of San Francisco would have cost more to maintain. And it's because of all the buildings and the infrastructure. It's like a small town. So the Army determined, they were determined to hand the site to the National Park Service. The National Park Service began to get cold feet. Congress began to sense an opportunity to pay down the national debt, and a move emerged to sell the Presidio for development. And out of all of those various forces, emerged a compromise, and the organization I work for, the Presidio Trust, is the result. So the Presidio is the only national park in America that has to pay for itself. We had 15 years to become financially self-sufficient or the land would be sold. Our primary business model is we take all of the buildings, we take the community assets that are left in the park, and we renovate them and lease them. And the revenue we generate supports the park. We only reinvest it in the park. That's the only reason we exist. But what it means, and we are not part of the National Park Service, that we manage part of a national park. It's a very unusual model. What it means is that the Presidio is like a laboratory. It's a laboratory, it's a little piece of a national park with all of that overlay of national park values around history and ecology. But because we aren't part of the National Park Service, we can experiment and we can play. And we've had a great time. And so that's really what I want to talk about tonight, is how we have conceptualized and approached reconciling this divide between nature and culture in our stewardship of the Presidio, and in particularly our stewardship of the Presidio's biodiversity, which is quite unique. So what's interesting is that at the time the Presidio was working on, was being developed by the Army over and over and over and over again. Interestingly enough, they never developed about 10%, about 7% of the site, about 100 acres. These areas that are shown here in orange. These are, together, the best remaining collection of San Francisco's native biodiversity. There are 15 different native plant communities captured in these tiny fragments. So these are areas that were never developed by the Army. And you think about San Francisco, almost all of San Francisco has been touched. You know, all of Golden Gate Park has been touched. Most of the coastal areas have been touched. Most of the parks in San Francisco are created landscapes. They're completely humanized environments. These are actually fragments of pre-contact San Francisco, and they host amazing biodiversity. Truly staggering. This is a glimpse of the Inspiration Point grassland in the spring. If you go out there right now, it actually looks very much like this. But what's incredible is when we step back and we actually counted, we studied and counted these tiny fragments, this 100 acres of Presidio landscape, the animal diversity and plant diversity contained within them is truly staggering. So 353 different native plant species in that 100 acres, in those 15 different native plant communities. 22 of those plant species are actually rare, endangered, or threatened. So to put that in context, that's a greater concentration of special status plant species than any other national park in America, any of the wilderness parks, even the parks in Hawaii, which are very small and contain incredibly fragile landscapes. On a per acre basis, we have more special status plant species than any other national park here in the middle of San Francisco. Incredible bird diversity, incredible insect diversity. I mean, truly staggering the incredible diversity that this mostly developed site contained. So the question became, what do we do about it? Because it's also true that those fragments, those little relics, were in danger. They were surrounded, they were, let's just go back to this for a second. They're these tiny islands, with the exception of the coastal dunes, but these tiny fragments, these precious little jewels. And the numbers of species, in this patch right here, there were 50 Presidio clarkii species, individual plants. Clarkii is this little plant about that big. There were a couple dozen San Francisco Lysingea plants over here. There was one Raven's manzanita, the last one on the planet, located over here. There was one Franciscan manzanita located over here. So one plant of a species of plant that historically existed all across San Francisco. So incredibly fragile. Invasive species coming in from all sides, being trampled by the public because no one had any idea about the riches that were there. So the challenge became, how do we take these incredibly small, incredibly rare habitats, the endangered plants that existed in them, and how do we create sustainable populations that will persist for the ages in a landscape that at the same time we were rehabilitating to generate revenue, enough revenue to support the park, that we were reimagining as this national park community. So how do you reconcile those values? So there are really three primary strategies that we use, and I just want to talk about each of those just briefly. The first had to do with protecting what we had. And here we decided that the best thing that we could do was to initiate a series of pilot projects, because these are landscapes no one had ever really stewarded. No one had ever really tried to restore a serpentine prairie in the middle of San Francisco, in the middle of a non-native forest, next to Presidio Heights, all the wealthiest homes in San Francisco. You can't just go there and do a control burn. like you can in Sequoia, right? So instead, we developed our own approach to control burn, which is a box burn, where we have this big Cor-Ten steel box. We drop it down using a crane. We do a control burn, a like 5-foot by 5-foot control burn, let it burn, move it over, do another piece of control burn, because we couldn't do a real control burn and have everybody, Dianne Feinstein losing her mind because we were burning the park below her house, literally below her house. Experimented around weed control, around integrated pest management, so that we could reduce the use of pesticides and herbicides, around strategies around mowing, around biocontrol, the use of goats, which we still have an amazing herd of goats if you ever go out to the Presidio. Yeah, they do yeoman service, those goats, man. So the first thing was a series of pilot projects and a really a very robust testing regimen so we could understand, monitoring regimen so we could understand which strategies worked and which strategies didn't. Second, we immediately created a community-based habitat restoration program because there were two problems we were trying to solve. First, we had no money to do this work because all of our resources were rehabilitating buildings to rent because we had to generate a financial engine to support the park. So everything, all the restoration work we did, we had almost no resources for. Second was the public had no idea what was in the park. And we needed to build community awareness about what these resources were, why they were important, and build an army of informed visitorship so that people began to use the park in the proper way, and we began to build essentially a sense, an informed set of stewards that could become advocates for the natural resources of the park. Because we knew down the road there were going to be inherent conflicts between our desire to steward these things and some of the existing park users. And volunteers went from 0 to now, this last year we had about 6,000 volunteers in the Presidio alone that donated about 70,000 hours of volunteer service, which is about 35 people, the equivalent of 35 full-time employees of work, which is an amazing amount of support that we get from volunteers. And they play this vitally important role, not only by providing direct support, but by being our ambassadors out in the community for the natural resources of the Presidio. So they play a really vitally important role in the park. So strategy 1 was taking care of what we had and trying to use innovative ways to do that, because we knew we couldn't just approach it like it was a piece of wilderness, up in the middle of the Sierra. We had to approach it in a way where we conceived of people as a critical part of the answer rather than the problem, which I remember going to graduate school. You went into landscape ecology or restoration ecology, people were always the problem. It was about keeping people off a site. It was about minimizing the disturbance caused by people being on the site. And here we had to flip that on its head and say, no, people are actually the solution in this environment. They're the way that we will preserve these habitats, these ecosystems. And that lesson is something that has continued to bear fruit throughout the work that we've done, and it will recur in my remarks tonight. So strategy 1, take care of what we had using innovative new strategies. Strategy 2 was we knew to create a really resilient natural ecosystem in the Presidio, that we had to address some of the shortcomings of the system as we found it. So the first had to do with fragmentation. Here were all of these small patches of natural area surrounded by golf course, surrounded by historic forests, surrounded by housing and building and roads and all of that. And the fragmentation really limited the ecological value of those ecosystems. Secondly, just the sheer acreage. It was such a small area. And if you have a system like, if you have a plant like Presidio clarkia that's adapted only to serpentine grassland, to thrive in one habitat type, and this is all the serpentine grassland that exists in your park, there's an upward limit on the amount of clarkia you can ever have in your park, and all of them are living in this tiny patch. So that means, one herd of loose goats, and your clarkia population is over. I mean, it creates a real vulnerability. And so we realized that what we needed to do was increase connectivity, and we needed to expand the footprint of our natural areas, but do it in a way that respected the history of the site, because the whole site's a National Historic Landmark District, that allowed us to continue to generate revenue. So we couldn't be taking down buildings, right? We had to renovate those to generate revenue. Allowed us to maintain all the infrastructure of the park, and allowed us to maintain most of the facilities that people love to use. The trails, the playing fields, the golf course, all of those things in the landscape. So we worked with the community over a series of years, and we developed a vision. And the vision is the Presidio Vegetation Management Plan. And there are two things that are important about the concept. The first is it conceives of the entire Presidio as an ecological whole. So it does not only focus on the natural area. So the first big move is you can see the expansion of the natural areas. So we go from 100 acres to 400 acres. And that's designed to increase connectivity, to increase the absolute footprint, and to restore riparian systems. The Army had a habit of burying creeks and lakes under piles of garbage. I'm not sure why, but they buried about 3 different riparian systems in the park under piles of garbage. And we wanted to get rid of all that because it was all contaminated and take it off site, and so we wanted to restore those systems. It's also one of the most valuable habitat types in San Francisco because most of it's been destroyed. So the first piece of this plan was to reduce fragmentation, to increase connectivity, and also to increase the absolute footprint of some of these critical habitats so that we could increase the populations and create isolated populations of these plants from each other so that if one was wiped out by disease or by some other intervention, there were other populations of these rare and endangered plants on the site. But the other important thing that it did, I mentioned earlier, which is it didn't only focus on these yellow areas, it focused on all the rest of it. And all the rest of it is parking lots, roads, the golf course, the historic forest, houses with yards, commercial buildings. It's the city, the water treatment plant, the police force, the police station, all that stuff. And it created a holistic vision of the Presidio as an ecological whole that incorporated the best in sustainable thinking without restoring the entire site as a natural area. And again, most people, and we had to have a very hard conversation with the environmental community. Their idea was cut all the trees down and restore the entire site to its pre-contact character. And we knew that that was infeasible because the public loved the trees and they loved the forest and the history was important and we were a National Historic Landmark after all. So we created this integrated plan that looked at the Presidio as an ecological whole and without understanding exactly how to solve the problems set a really tough bar for us, which was reconceptualize these historic landscapes in more ecological terms so that you preserve the essential qualities of them as historic landscapes, but reimagine them in a way that they support the ecological value of all of these restored natural areas that are woven through them. Again, without understanding exactly how to do it, it just set for us this ambition that we would do it. So we set about doing this work. We started at Crissy Field. How many of you would have recognized that this was Crissy Field? Back in the day, this is what we started with. It was 100 acres of hard-packed dirt and asphalt. We worked with George Hargraves, as Jeff mentioned, and came up with a very bold, beautiful, simple vision for what Crissy Field was going to be. And we thought it was obvious that that was an improvement, that Crissy Field, greening, getting rid of all this asphalt and these railroad tracks and all that, that was an obvious improvement. Unfortunately, these folks didn't think it was an obvious improvement. It turns out that Crissy Field, in its derelict condition, had a really, really, really very active community of existing users. Thousands of dog walkers walked their dogs there every day. Thousands of bicyclists rode their bikes. And all of this jammed into this tiny little band of derelict beach covered with rubble from the 1906 earthquake, squished between that and the cyclone fence. Literally thousands of people a day used it. And they were outraged that we could imagine a Crissy Field that was green, that wasn't just asphalt and hard-packed dirt. And so it was an important reminder of how important it is in every process to understand whether or not a site really has an existing constituency or not and what their aspirations are, and make sure that whatever you're doing speaks to their aspirations. The net result of this was about 100 public meetings, literally. My first one, I had 400 people, all of them angry. I had about 50 angry dogs, literally, barking and doing what dogs do. And 100 meetings later, we finally reached consensus. It took us 5 years. This is the untold Crissy Field story. It literally took us 5 years to get through the public process because we had forgotten the cardinal rule of the public landscape that even a derelict site like that waterfront had a constituency and was beloved and had folks that needed to be part of the process before you would succeed in transforming even a completely derelict site like that. So of course we were successful, and this is the after. That photo was a landscape that was about right there in the middle of the airfield, but of course you know that George Hargreaves, this is a very early work by Hargreaves, and it's one of the first places that George began to wrestle with the integration of ecological process and design, which for me was another really interesting element of this project, because we were actually very interested in this question, thinking back to the conversation that I had on the bridge with the Chief of Natural Resources, the Chief of Cultural Resources. Very early on, I decided that the idea of natural process as a way to give form in the built environment was a really interesting idea worth exploring. It was a place where these values could come together. You're creating a humanized landscape that takes advantage of the outgrowth of natural process. And so I actually asked George if he would imagine a landscape where a series of interventions by people interacted with natural process to create form. And the answer I got was, you know what, we're not going to do that. And I said, well, why? And he said, it won't look good on opening day. And I thought to myself, wow, that is a really, 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 really bad reason. Now, of course, he went on, and the firm went on to do amazing work. And this was very early in that conversation about form giving and natural process and sort of what is the role of the designer. You know, are we the paintbrush, or are we the painter? And so it was. I mean, it was a very interesting early moment in that conversation. But I remembered that so vividly. This tension between our desire as landscape architects to create a beautiful thing, to make that thing that we see in our mind's eye from opening, on opening day, as opposed to understanding the way nature interacts on a site to create form, and allowing those processes to run wild. And so giving up a little bit of your control over the outcome, but creating something that will really persist and will be self-generating, which is the trade-off, right? I mean, these natural systems, this marsh continues to evolve and continues to change. What's interesting is we ended up taking this out of the project, and we implemented this part of the project ourselves because we wanted to create a landscape that was dynamic. And we thought it was vitally important to understand and to begin to experiment around how landscapes evolve in interacting with natural process on a site. And that's something, again, that we continue to experiment with and think a lot about, and that really informs a lot of our work at the park. So this idea of expanding the footprint of habitat, we got off to kind of a rocky start, but we learned our lesson the first time. And we began to look for truly derelict sites, like here at Mountain Lake. I don't know, anyone know Mountain Lake? Okay, this is what the edge of it used to look like. Probably was before you were out at Mountain Lake. But this is this is where the Army used to pump water out of the lake. They used to drain the lake every year to irrigate the golf course. And the whole eastern edge had this series of pumps and tanks. And then the rest of it was covered with blue gum, Tasmanian blue gum eucalyptus that dropped leaves and polluted the lake every year. When Caltrans built Highway 1, they ran all of the water from Highway 1 into the lake. So the lake had about 6 feet of contaminated sediment in the bottom of it, contaminated with lead and cadmium and copper and all that stuff. So it was a real mess. But it was beloved. The community came to us and said, our lake is dying, please help us. There were 2 swans that lived in the lake, and one of them died from lead poisoning, and that was the sort of swan in the coal mine that helped us understand that, in fact, there was something really wrong with the lake. So this time, learning our lesson that first time around, we created a community-based stewardship program to get people involved in the lake and help craft a vision for the lake. We began to think a lot about how design can mediate between people and natural process by through small interventions, whether they be fences, whether they be designed features by artists, whether they be modifying the planting a little bit so that the natural system you're planting is actually more beautiful along the path, whether you're planting hedges along the path, even though naturally they didn't exist, hedges of natives. So we began to ask ourselves, what role can designers play in mediating between natural process and between humans, because Mountain Lake is heavily impacted by people. We came up with totally wacky ways of mitigating the impacts of people on the lake. So one of the big problems with the lake was it was full of old goldfish. And it turns out old goldfish become really big carp over the generations. And that for generations, people had released unwanted pets in the lake because they thought it was more humane than flushing them down the toilet. And pet stores, it turns out, don't take pets back, right? They won't take your goldfish back. So people had no other option but to dump their pets in the lake, and the pets had destroyed the lake. There were red-eared sliders, there were bullfrogs, there were crayfish. Who knew people had pet crayfish? I'm telling you, pet crayfish. Newts and salamanders and frogs, all these things. So we created an amnesty box where people could dump their unwanted pets. And we would come each day and we'd empty the amnesty box and we'd take their pets, because we had a relationship with this company up in Sonoma, and they'd take your pets and they'd send them to farm ponds on wineries, so a really cushy life. And so we developed this program, and it's been amazing. Every week we get goldfish, and we get frogs, and we get salamanders, and we get more crayfish. Again, believe it or not, people have their pet crayfish. Just doesn't seem like a very cozy kind of pet. I don't know. But anyway, but it's been amazing. And these are the kinds of interventions that one has to make as a landscape architect if you really are focused on managing biodiversity in cities, where you have to get into the minds of the community that is affected by your intervention and ask yourself, well, what is the underlying issue? What is the underlying impulse that leads them to do something that is actually contrary to your ecological goals? In this case, it turns out all we had to do was give them a humane place to set their pets, and we could address one of the real formative issues that we were wrestling with in the site. Based on this good working relationship with the community, they allowed us to do some crazy things. We netted about 10,000 fish out of the lake, including 2 5-foot-long sturgeon. Who knew that somebody had released their pet sturgeon? I don't know who keeps pet sturgeon. This is one of my staff carrying the sturgeon that he netted. But then after we netted the 10,000 fish, they actually were willing to let us poison the lake to get the last few remaining non-native fish out, so we could reintroduce the full suite of native species, because the non-native fish were destroying the ecology of the lake. Similarly, they let us and worked with us actually to plan the removal of hundreds of trees around the lake, because they were non-native trees that were polluting the lake. Even though they were beloved, even though they had swings on them that they used to use to swing out into the lake, by working collaboratively and engaging them early, we were able to work with them to develop a plan they could live with that allowed us to remove some features in the park that they had long loved. The upshot is we've been able to reintroduce about 50 extirpated plants and animals, a whole array of tree species that used to live along the edges during the Spanish times. We know from the pollen analysis we've done, there are all these species that existed there before the Spanish came. Reintroduce a number of animals, including western pond turtles, which are a threatened species, Pacific chorus frogs, which is the ribbit frog that you hear in every movie. We're working on reintroducing mussels, freshwater mussels that were extirpated during the gold rush because 49ers like mussels. They also love turtle soup, by the way. That's why there are no turtles left in the lake. And a whole array of submerged aquatic vegetation. So reestablishing this completely native ecosystem, so that today, that area that we were just looking at, where those tanks were, contains a full suite of native species that you would have found once upon a time, pre-contact, along the edges of Mountain Lake. So the third and final strategy that we've used. So the first strategy we've used was taking care of these fragments we had. The second had to do with taking derelict landscapes, contaminated landscapes, underutilized landscapes, paved landscapes, unused turf, in critical locations throughout the Presidio, and restoring them, working with the community to restore their natural values. The third of these 3 strategies that we've been using has to do with what I call the matrix, right? So if the orange are the natural areas, the green is the historic forest, and all of the gray is the design landscape zones where all the development is. Those green and gray zones are these heavily humanized landscapes, heavily impacted, heavily used. The Presidio is a community of about 7,500 people living and working in it. So it's the only national park that has a community of 7,500 people living in the center of it. And those 7,500 people are there 24 hours a day. They're living and working. They're doing all the things. They're running in the park. They're playing in the park. Have a very large impact on the park. So the third thing that we've done is focus on how we can manage the urbanized parts of the Presidio, how we can manage these cultural landscapes in these developed areas in a more ecological way. So we've developed a whole program of replanting the Presidio Forest, which is the largest cultural resource in the park. It's a plantation, totally synthetic, doing it in a way to increase biodiversity and to protect all of the wildlife species that have developed and begun to use the park. Developing this phased program of removing trees and replanting them in a more ecological way. The truth is, only non-native tree species will persist there. So we can't build native forest. So we're rebuilding a more biodiverse non-native forest intentionally, trying to understand the way a native forest operates and recreating that structural diversity using non-native species. Because there's no way for us to build a native forest that would restore the historic character of the site. Similarly, all of the design landscapes, the historic parade grounds, the historic gardens, we are always looking for natural analogs and trying to understand the ecological services that are provided by those natural ecologs. So this is the Fort Scott Parade Ground. Well, what would a coastal prairie in this location have been like? What's the species composition it would have had? What wildlife species would it have supported? How would it have worked as a natural ecosystem, even though this is predominantly non-native species? Similarly, looking at all of the design landscapes, the gardens, the planted beds, and understanding the contributions of individual garden species. We're working on a research project right now with the California Academy of Sciences, looking at the relative insect diversity of the 15 most common garden plants in the Presidio, trying to understand which ones support greater insect diversity, because insect diversity is the core, is sort of the foundation upon which biodiversity sits in any landscape. And there's very little research that's been done about the insect diversity of non-native species. Almost all the research is about the insect diversity supported by native species. So we're trying to understand which of the plants in the park actually support more wildlife, and so that we can begin to plant those species in many of the landscape renovation projects we're doing. We've been doing a series of turf conversion projects where we're taking irrigated turf out of the landscape and creating gardens that are designed to both reduce water use, reduce maintenance, reduce the use of pesticides and herbicides, but also support biodiversity, but using non-native species. Again, trying to, and then monitoring those gardens to see which plants support the most bird diversity, which kinds of structural characteristics of the landscape support the greatest bird diversity, so that we can begin to bring those learnings into our design landscape in a more intentional way. And lastly, we've been really engaging new technology. How many of you have seen our Hawk Cam? If you haven't, you need to go online. There was a piece in SFGate a couple weeks ago. We put a video monitor up in a tree, a eucalyptus tree, about 100 feet above ground over a hawk's nest. And it's a 24/7 videotape of what the hawks are doing in their nest. And just Wednesday, one of the eggs hatched. So there's a little fuzzy chick, and there's another egg waiting to hatch in the nest. But trying to reach new audiences in new ways so that people begin to understand. And this, by the way, this is in a eucalyptus tree. Okay, so all of our expectations about where nature lives and how it works. Here we have this hawk. Wouldn't be here were it not for this eucalyptus tree, because it would have been all open grassland. So how interesting is that to think about, and being able to connect to this really magical, in a real way, event, in the birth of a chick. So we're very active in the way we manage the designed landscape in the historic forest. We've developed a very aggressive coyote monitoring and management program. Coyotes are one of the biggest challenges in the management of parks in America. There are coyotes in every major city in America now. They're heavily adapted to urban environments, and yet there's very little known about how coyotes in cities actually live. So we've actually collared all of our coyotes and given them really cool colored jewelry, these ear tags, and we monitor where they go. And it's amazing where they go. This map shows you each blue dot is a day in the life of one of the coyotes that actually left, because in the spring the coyotes from the previous year, the young coyotes disperse. And this coyote went as far as Portola Valley over a series of a couple weeks. So it gives you a sense of how mobile wildlife are in cities and what we see. And so now we know how far each of our coyotes go in the course of even one day. Look at the distance this coyote went in one day. It went from Land's End to almost to Pacifica in one day. It's amazing how far these animals move. And again, we know very little about them. Now we've learned so much that it has allowed us to develop really proactive management strategies that allow us to mediate between people who tend to bring their dogs and coyotes that hate. Coyotes see all canines as competition, particularly during pupping season, and they can become incredibly aggressive. And what we've been able to do is, by understanding the lifeways of our coyotes and by testing and piloting a variety of experiments, we now understand how to induce them to raise their pups in the right location in an area that's the furthest from the public. So for example, we encourage our coyotes to, because we only have one denning pair. People think we have 50 or 100 coyotes in the Presidio. There are actually 5 coyotes in the whole Presidio. There's one den each year, and we encourage them to den in the golf course because there are very few dogs in the middle of the golf course. And we use the craziest things like wolf urine. Did you know you could buy wolf urine on the internet? I had no idea. But you can buy mountain lion urine and you can buy wolf urine, and you can spray it on the ground and the coyotes hate it. And so we use things like that and certain kinds of noises to discourage them from denning in the wrong places and encourage them to den in the right places far enough from people. And as a result of this, combined with really aggressive outreach, we've been able to almost eliminate conflicts between coyotes and people in the Presidio, which is a really great accomplishment because you can't move a coyote. You can manage a coyote or you can kill a coyote. By law, you can't move them. So, and they play such an important role in the ecosystem of the park, we want them to be able to coexist. And again, these are the kinds of interactions and interventions that one has to make to manage biodiversity in an urban environment like the Presidio. So 2 more ideas, then I'll stop talking. The first is we are working with about 20 cities across the United States to develop a new tool called the Urban Biodiversity Inventory Framework, aka UBIF, a really, really sexy name, I know. UBIF is a tool that we will be able to use. So we're working with, these are the core 5. We're working with a bunch of local organizations. But it's a tool that we can use to assess the relative biodiversity of landscapes. And the idea is that we can, if communities across the country use this tool, that we can compare the relative biodiversity of different parks within a city and between cities. So because we're collecting the data in the same way, and we're using the same framework. And it's really exciting because then it also gives us a tool to measure biodiversity through time. And what's important about it is it doesn't only look at natural areas. So the basic premise is this: you break a landscape into different kind of habitat types that have a consistent structure. So if you look up here, many of these are natural systems, but there's this historic forest category. There's cultural and design landscape, which is actually broken down. There's irrigated turf, there are planter beds, there are all these subcategories. And you identify surrogate species in each of these 5 taxa. And those surrogate species are selected because they are believed to be good indicators of biological health in a landscape. And the idea is just to count their prevalence in these landscapes and to track the prevalence of these surrogate species through time. And what's really great about it is it's designed to take advantage of INAT, iNaturalist. I don't know if anyone has iNaturalist on their phones, but it's an incredible app. It's a citizen science-based platform that was developed by the California Academy of Sciences. And anytime you see an animal or a plant, you can use INAT to track it. And that gets loaded up into our system as a sighting. And so essentially anyone that comes to the public, any member of the public that comes to the Presidio is going to be doing our monitoring for us. So it's this completely egalitarian, citizen science-driven platform, again, helping us do our work, but also helping build awareness about the biodiversity of the Presidio at the same time. So it's a really fantastic tool that has multiple benefits. We're actually launching this program and starting the baseline monitoring work at a BioBlitz that we're holding on the 27th of April in the Presidio in honor of Earth Day a little later this month. So lastly, circling back around to the world of landscape architecture, is the Tunnel Tap Project. I know I've talked to some of you about the Tunnel Tap Project, so I'm not going to talk about it a lot. But suffice to say that all of these ideas, all of this thinking, this sort of bolus of work that I've been talking about in the Presidio, that we've really tried to bring all of those learnings to bear in our reimagining of this site. So the Tunnel Tap Project occupies this new territory, new terrain that's being created by Doyle Drive. That's the predecessor roadway there. The project has really two parts. It has the new tunnel top parklands that are being designed by Jim Corner, three parts. Up here, it has a 4-acre youth campus that's down below, and it also includes an expansion of the Crissy Field marsh up under the freeway to connect into the Tennessee Hollow watershed. So the reconstruction of the freeway creates this incredible opportunity for us to really join together two parts of the park that were severed from each other for about 80 years, and to build a new center for the park that connects Crissy Field and the main post. So this is what the site looks like today. And we've really tried to reimagine the site as a site where people and nature can interact in many of the ways that we've just been talking about. So this is one of the after views, but a couple of other thoughts about the way we've approached the work. We've been working with Jim Corner, I think you all know, designer of the High Line, amazing firm, very collaborative, wonderful to work with, awesome kind of openness to input from the community. I mean, they've been just dynamite to work with. But so, for example, we've imagined the whole tunnel top site, which is this site here, as a really important piece of the infrastructure that wildlife will use to move from Crissy Field up into the heart of the Presidio. So thinking about it, even though these are fully designed landscapes, how can the design landscape of the main post function as a habitat corridor, again, using all non-native species? How do we think about this landscape in ecological terms? They've developed this series of design landscape archetypes that build off of native plant community archetypes, but use a mix of native and mostly non-native species. As I mentioned earlier, we're testing a bunch of non-native species to understand which of them support the best insect diversity, so we can use those species in these landscapes to support more bird diversity and improve the ecological performance of those landscapes. And just generally trying to create an experience that will, because of the view, we know everyone's going to want to come, frankly, and take their selfie standing there, because the view of the Golden Gate Bridge is really awe-inspiring when you're out there on the tunnels. And that is a really sneaky way that we can use to connect everybody to new thinking about ecology, because we're weaving through the site all of these moments where people can understand the way the landscape is working, and we want to make the ecological performance of the landscape apparent. So we've already started monitoring the site, and we will continue to monitor the site so we understand its ecological performance, and then we'll communicate that back out to the public at various points all over the site, so we can be transparent about what's working and what's not working, because the entire site is really this big experiment in urban ecological thinking in the 21st century. The last and really most important thing that the project does is it creates an environment for kids. And I'm going to leave on this note because I think it's vitally important. I went into this work because I was so in love with parks. And what I quickly realized about parks and protected areas is that parks and protected areas are a very new idea. You know, I've always thought of parks as something that has existed for all time. Parks as we know them really are a 160-year-old idea, something like that, which is like a moment in the history of humankind. You know, there have been lots of kinds of gardens, there have been hunting parks, but this idea of a park as a democratic public place is really a fairly new idea in the history of humankind. And what I see going on in the world today is really terrifying to me about the future of parks. You know, we see this huge increase in the amount of poaching that's going on in the great national parks in Africa. We have deforestation going on in the national parks in Amazonia. We have deforestation going on in national parks in Humboldt County, where people are cutting trees down to plant plantations. We have urban pressures of all kinds beginning to happen in these parks. We have development creeping up around parks so that they're increasingly isolated from other nearby areas that support their ecologies. And so, for me, the vitally important effort that all of us who work in parks have to undertake right now as we enter the 21st century is building future stewards. And it's a really difficult challenge because we live at a moment where we see an increase in the incidence of nearsightedness in children because they're all staring at their computer monitors rather than they're outside actually doing things and looking at things far away and actually playing in the outdoors. And so we've got these developments that are sort of taking this notion of stewardship in the opposite direction. And so critical to this project and critical to the work that we do is thinking about those future stewards. How do we create experiences for kids that are so exciting, that are so engaging, that challenge them and allow them to develop and take risks in ways that are exciting so that they want to develop a relationship to the outdoors, and frankly so we can compete with our video games. You know, so parks can compete with video games in terms of their fun. And so we're taking a stab at that as part of this project with Jim Corner, building this youth campus that includes this 3-acre outpost, which is really an environment designed to allow children to take risks, which is not what most playgrounds are. Playgrounds are designed to keep cities safe from lawsuits. They're really about managing liability and managing risk. And what we're trying to do is turn that on its head and create an environment that will challenge kids and that will build that generation of future stewards so that we can be sure that we have parks in the 21st and 22nd and 23rd and 24th centuries. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you have about anything I've talked about. Thanks.
That was maybe the most informative 1 hour of complex landscape architecture issues all woven into one presentation that I've ever seen. So my hat is off to you.
Presidio.
I have one question before we go to the group, and that has to do with, I was wondering if you could speak to the diversity of sort of parallel professionals that you work with, including landscape architects that have specializations within the Presidio, but then the kind of, the biologists, all the other professions that have to come together to make one of these projects happen.
Yeah, so in the Presidio, one of the wonderful things about working in a place like the Presidio is, well, two. First, people work there because they love the place. We are all there because we love the place, and so many landscape architects work all over the world, and they develop a pretty thin understanding of place. And the advantage of working in a place like the Presidio is you stay in one place, a fairly small place, for a long time, and you really develop a deep knowledge, a kind of deep understanding of a place. And that's really different. I think the profession generally doesn't speak to that kind of experience. But there are other professions that do. And so the beautiful thing is that I get to work with an amazing collection of specialists. So on my own staff, I have planners, urban designer, landscape architects specializing in urban ecosystems. I have a landscape architect that's a historic landscape architect. I have a landscape architect that's really technical and specializes in plant selection and detailing. I have a series of architects. One of them is a historic architect, and the others are just sort of straight-up building architects. I have ecologists on staff. I have a wildlife biologist on staff, 2 wildlife biologists on staff. I feel like I have one of everything on staff. It's really exciting. Plus, the other thing that we get to do is I also manage the staff that maintain the landscapes. So, and again, this is something that landscape architects just don't get to do. To be able to have the folks that are designing a landscape and building the landscape and operating the landscape and maintaining the landscape all in one team. So that when we're developing a project, the maintenance staff are actually participating and giving us insights about what's going to be hard to maintain and what's going to be easy to maintain. And the biologists are talking to us about the ecological performance of the things that we're designing and providing input into the design. So it's a very collaborative process that results in landscapes that I think of as sort of landscapes for the ages. Because the other thing that we have, the advantage we have, is we have to take care of this place forever. And that means you make a different set of decisions than somebody that's building an office park and going to sell it in 5 years or 10 years. I mean, it's a really different frame of reference. And I think it's part of why when in that early conversation I referenced with George and I, he was so used to working in a commercial space where the time horizon is so short that the idea of being willing to wait 50 years for a landscape to truly develop and not thinking twice about it, which is again a kind of national park mindset, just was really foreign. And I think it's really foreign to a lot of professionals. So anyway, it's great. I love working with such a diverse array of professionals.
That's great.
Yep.
All right, so we'll open up. This mic allows people who are online to hear. So if you have any questions, I can pass it on to you.
Come on, lay 'em on me. Give me a rough one.
There may be questions from the online team. Yes. Oh.
Yeah. So.
Well, here, I'll just repeat it.
I'm really curious to know your problem-solving techniques, because you have these really unique problems in the city, and especially this child one. How do you guys develop these kind of solutions? Because obviously you have a very diverse group, but how does it start? How do you even start problem-solving these kind of issues?
Yeah.
So Amanda is asking how these complex problems or even basic problems begin to be solved.
Yeah, great question. I would say that there are three critical things. So the first thing is clearly defining the problem you're trying to solve. And I think that's a step people skip all the time. So for example, in this one, the first problem we thought we were solving was creating a space that would connect kids to nature. And that was how we defined the problem. And we convened a series of experts, both staff experts, but also pediatricians, youth development specialist teachers. We brought them together for a day, and we had a conversation about the state-of-the-art thinking about youth and connecting them to nature. And they said, connecting kids to nature is great, but why do you want to connect them to nature? And so we asked that question, well, why do we want to connect them to nature? And they said, honestly, the biggest problem children have today is they don't have experiences where they can take risks. In a way, they develop a sense of mastery over the outdoors, and so they never develop a connection at a very early age. The kind of connection that somebody like me, I grew up next to a field, I spent all my time outdoors. I just grew up in that world, and I developed that love of nature just almost organically. They never do, and if it doesn't happen when they're early, it never happens. It gets harder to develop as someone gets older. And so they said, so really, the problem you need to solve to connect kids to nature is create an environment where they can take beneficial risks. And so that really shaped our thinking. So that's the second piece of what we do. First piece is define the problem, test the problem with input from experts, from the community, from a variety of staff members, and make sure we're actually solving the right problem. So there we define the problem more clearly. And then we go through an iterative problem-solving ideation process where we're testing different ideas against the stated outcome and trying to get to the best possible solution within all the constraints we have, historic preservation and money and all that. But it's this very iterative ideation process that we use. And we're always testing against all of the different constraints, but also always going back to the problem we're trying to solve, because you need to have a kind of rigor around the problem you're trying to solve to shed all of the ideology that constrains so much of the thinking in the world of landscape. I mean, my feeling is that most of school, okay, I'm going to say something about school. Going into dangerous territory now, I know, because here I am in a school, but I believe that most of what I learned in school was really so grounded in ideology and not grounded in fact. It wasn't grounded in the observed reality of the world. And especially when it comes to nature, nature is such a fraught idea. It's such an ideological idea. It's a thing that's bounded by literature and bounded by art and these inherited notions of what nature is, mostly visual ideas about what nature is for most people, based in no way on an understanding of ecology or ecological process or what actually brings value and what are the relative values of different interventions in the landscape. And so what I really learned and have learned in doing my work here is that deep observation without prejudice is one of the core things that people interested in transforming the landscape need to undertake. And that we also need to be open to the fact that the environment is a completely dynamic thing. And in school, you're not taught that. You're taught like there are these evergreen principles about ecology, and in fact, the landscape is constantly changing. And the urban landscape is really constantly changing, and nature is very much more dynamic than I think people like to admit. And so that's, I guess, the fourth ingredient for me is because we live in this closed ecosystem and it's fairly small, we are constantly measuring the outcomes of what we do to see in a kind of unprejudiced and objective way what's working and what isn't, to try to shed these ideological ideas about what we should be doing and focus on what really has an impact and what doesn't on the problem that we've tried to define really clearly. So that's the way we approach it. So it's sort of human-centered design. I mean, it's sort of what IDEO does. They have all these cool terms for it, and are much more proficient at it. We just sort of bumble through it, but it's really looking at the world with open eyes and in an unprejudiced way, and speaking to your audience, the audience you're trying to serve, and trying to have an unprejudiced conversation, and then testing ideas and picking the one that's best. So pretty much.
That's good. So. Thank you. Philip.
So you're your own client. You have a lot of free reign. But then there are legal constraints. Do you have to deal with, the outside world when you're designing these beautiful landscapes?
We're not really Vatican City, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So
you want to restate it?
Yeah. So Philip's saying that you're your own client, but there must be legal constraints and other things outside of your space that you have to grapple with.
Yeah. No, I mean we are our own client, but we by no means have complete control over what we can do. I mean the Presidio is a National Historic Landmark District, which means we're subject to the National Historic Preservation Act and all the consulting parties that monitor what we're doing, both local, federal, and state. We're a national park, and we're a federal agency, so any significant move we make, we have to go through the NEPA process, which has a public involvement component. We're surrounded by all of the wealthiest neighborhoods in San Francisco, all of whom have been using the park for generations and love it just the way it is. So anytime we want to change anything, they're very concerned. And very interested in what we're doing because it's such a used and inhabited place. It's not an empty site by any means. And so we have a lot of constituents for the work that we're doing, but they bring a richness to the work, because there are so many different perspectives that it creates this opportunity to innovate that's really interesting. Because those are really diverse perspectives. There's a recreation, local park perspective, there's a national park perspective, a history perspective, an ecology perspective. And at the intersection of all those things lies really a real opportunity for creativity. So we don't really have a very free hand. In fact, the work we do is heavily contextualized in the place and also in the community and also in the non-human community,
In that case, that must compliment you for managing the process to work with
Well, you always have to have vision. I mean, there's don't get me wrong, there's a role for vision in all this, right? And I mean, the thing that's been so amazing working with Jim Corner on this or with George Hargraves on Crissy is even in the iterative conversation with the community and the iterative conversation with the State Historic Preservation Officer and the National Park Service and all of our regulatory partners, they still hung on to that core vision of what they were trying to create. And throughout all the work we've done, we've hung on to this core vision we have about what it means for the Presidio to be an urban national park. And we're never going to let go of that. That's the sort of foundation upon which all of this builds. So it's like anything. It's at the intersection of vision and reality. I have a coworker, my mentor, that always says, "A vision without resources is a hallucination," and which I think is true. And I think a vision without reality is a hallucination too, because you need to ground, anchor your vision in reality, And to me, all of those different stakeholders are just reality.
So for all you students out there, please write that down. Ian.
I have a question. I want to ask you how to remediate the pollution in Crissy Field.
Ian's asking how to remediate the pollution at Crissy Field.
Yeah, so we actually inherited from the Army, not only at Crissy Field, but throughout the Presidio, about 13 landfills. They were all over. They had filled the old Crissy Marsh with a bunch of contamination. It was a motor pool, so there was leaked oil and leaked gas. But all the way up Tennessee Hollow, they had polluted Mountain Lake. You know, I mean, there was a lot of junk in the Presidio. I don't think they ever sent any garbage off-site, really. I think they just filled creeks. But so every project is different, and it really depends on what the contaminants are. When we were working on Crissy Field, for example, we actually did some really interesting phytoremediation work where we took, we had certain contaminants in soil, we piled up the soil, and we planted these varieties of mustard, and they pulled the contaminants out of the soil, and we cut the mustard down and we disposed of the mustard off-site, and we kept planting rounds of this plant until the soil was clean. It was the most interesting thing. It was really crazy. But it was because of the kind of contamination that it had. There are other situations where we excavate the soil and we treat it. So like at Mountain Lake, we actually excavated the soil and we treated it and we pulled out the heavy metals. There are other places where we cap contamination because the actual contamination is fairly low. Levels are low. The potential danger to humans or to natural systems is low. And frankly, there's an environmental cost of sending contamination off-site somewhere far away, because there's nowhere nearby you can dispose of that material. So we're really careful about where we send, you know, which things we send off-site and which things we manage on-site and somehow contain so they don't leak. So at Crissy Field, we did all those things, actually. Some of it's capped, some of it we sent off-site, some of it we remediated using innovative processes. So.
How did you know about the mustard? Somebody,
It was an experiment, actually, back in the day. I don't even know if it's used anymore. I mean, it was this experiment that we did. You know, Crissy Field was a really interesting early experiment in sustainable park development. So we balanced cut and fill on the site. We planted native species everywhere. Even the airfield, the 28-acre grass airfield, was planted with fully with native grass species. You know, a lot of things like that. Recycled all the concrete, recycled all the asphalt. It was a really, really interesting project, you know, very early on in that conversation about sort of sustainable landscape practice. So.
Is there a website to?
She's trying to figure out like how she can see all that you're talking about.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Oh,
you know,
see the research.
Well, there are two places to go. So if you, the Presidio Trust, you can go to the Presidio Trust website, and there's a lot of information about all our projects. There's good information about Crissy Field at the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. That's a really long name. I think they're www.parksconservancy.org. They're our nonprofit partner, and they managed. I worked there when I worked on the Crissy Field project, and they have a lot of great information about Crissy Field on their website. So if you're specifically interested in Crissy Field. So.
Anybody else? Alex?
Because I looked at the 5 finalists for the funnel tops.
Yeah.
At least 2 other ones, at least from looking at them, seem to have that sort of integration with natural landscape and the human factor. What made you choose
So,
James Corner?
Alex is asking, there were 5 finalists in the Tunnel Tops project, and 2 other finalists also had very natural systems oriented solutions. And how did you decide on James Corner?
Yeah, good question. So we conducted this competition in a really unusual way. Because we wanted the public to feel like they were part of it. So we selected the 5 teams, and we actually hired them to do conceptual designs for us. And we did that so in the end we would own the ideas. And we did it so that we could interact with them in a way that you normally don't get to. So I had a phone call with every team every week during the competition. And we created an opportunity for the teams to interact with the public. and the public to get a sense of what they were like, for them to hear the public's interests and concerns. So it was a really different kind of competition. It was not your normal competition. Then once the schemes were developed, they presented them to the public, and we left them. We created this design lab where we had all 5 of the schemes up for about 6 months. And we created all of these approaches for different kinds of events where the public could come and they could review the projects. And about 10,000 people came through the design gallery. We also took the projects out into the community, and we took them to the Bayview, to Hunters Point, to the Sunset, to the Western Addition, to Chinatown. And we tested the ideas with the community, and we targeted specifically members of the public that weren't coming to the Presidio. Because we wanted to know, one of the core things we're trying to do is make the Presidio welcoming to everybody. So we wanted to make sure that the landscape would be welcoming to people who don't use the Presidio, as well as people that do. And we got great feedback. And the 2 things that we asked were, which team did you like working with the best? And which scheme most reflected your aspirations for the site? And by far, the favorite scheme was the corner scheme. So that was a really important data point. The other really important data point is, of the 5 schemes, it's the only one that came even close to hitting our budget, actually.
That's great.
Yeah, which is really important because we gave them a budget. And it's a really important lesson because we said early on, from the very beginning, here's our budget. And we said, the winner is not going to be judged based on the flashiest scheme. We want you to give us a realistic scheme. We want it to be something that could be implemented. And we're going to look at the price, and we're going to look at it from a feasibility standpoint. So don't do what happens so often in competitions. People develop the big flashy thing. And to their credit, all the schemes developed real schemes. They weren't crazy, impossible schemes. They really took that to heart. But in the end, this is the scheme that really resonated with the public the most, and so we selected that scheme. Yeah, so that's why. I mean, I love them all. I felt at the end of the process, because, I'd been talking to these folks every week, all the teams, and it was like, I felt like I was dating 5 people all at once, and I had to break up with 4 of them. I mean, it was heartbreaking to have to tell the 4 teams that lost, I can't, no more weekly calls.
Right. So. Any other questions? Okay, one last question.
What?
Some part of the field is a low-lying area. So, what's the strategy to sea level rise and the flood issue?
Yeah, huge issue. When we built...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so what is our strategy around sea level rise at Crissy Field? Because it is low. The truth is, it is very low. In fact, let's go back and take a little look at it. So low, in fact, that most of Crissy Field will be underwater by 2100, by the year 2100, certainly at high tide. So we're doing a couple things. The first thing we're doing is we're actually raising this entire flat area by about 5 feet. And we're doing that for 2 reasons. The first is to address sea level rise. The second is that whole area has a landfill under it that we don't want to disturb. It's actually full of really important archaeology, and we don't want to dig it up, and the quality of the soil is really bad. And so by adding this large amount of good soil over the top of it, we have a better chance of actually developing a healthy landscape. So we're actually adding it. It's sort of a double win, right? We're dealing with the contamination and the garbage that's underneath it, and we're making the landscape more resilient. But we're also looking at, out here there's the beach that has the trail along it. And so long-term, we're looking at strategies for actually creating a buffer by building up the sand dunes along the water's edge to make them more resilient and make them resist the gradual increases in the elevation in sea level rise. But it's a real challenge because there are a number of buildings, especially down here. I mean, this whole building will have to come out because half the building will be flooded. The buildings at the west end will all be flooded. They're historic buildings, and we'll just have to abandon them or, raise them or do something because they're definitely going to be flooded back then. So it's a real tough issue. The nice thing is most of the Presidio is, at elevation 30 or 35 or 40. I mean, or 50. I mean, at its highest point, it's like elevation 800 or something. I mean, it's really high. So
So what we're going to do now is we're going to end the broadcast. If anyone else has questions here in the room, you're welcome to come up and ask Michael. But I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Let's give him a hand.
Yeah.
This was really quite awesome.